There are things that belong in the West Texas canyons, and things that absolutely do not. The silence, the shimmering heat off the red rocks, the shadow of a hawk overhead, they all have their place. But what I saw that afternoon, nestled in the dust behind a prickly pear cactus, had no place anywhere. At first, I thought it was just trash someone had left behind. A coil of patterned rope next to a dirty bundle of rags. But as I got closer, my steps slowing, the scene resolved itself through the heat haze. The patterned rope was a rattlesnake, and the bundle of rags beside it was fur. It was a German Shepherd puppy, panting and bloodied, lying next to the body of the monster it had just killed. A flicker of awe went through me. What a fighter! But then I saw its leg. My admiration curdled into ice in my stomach. It was swollen to twice its normal size, a tight, grotesque distortion of a limb. And as my eyes traced up from the paw, I saw them. The two tiny dark puncture marks that told me this little hero had just signed his own death warrant. My name is Ethan. I am 42 years old, a veteran of the Marine Corps, and now I mostly try to keep to myself. The canyons of West Texas offered the kind of deep, searing silence that could bake the noise out of a man's head, and I needed that more than anything. The sun was a merciless white disk in the vast blue sky, beating down on the red rock and the sparse, thorny vegetation. I had my usual gear on, the uniform of my quiet life. A faded plaid shirt worn open over a simple gray t-shirt, worn denim jeans, and the sturdy work boots that had carried me over countless miles of unforgiving terrain. This solitude, this heat, it was my therapy. A way to walk off ghosts that still lingered from another life, in another desert far from here. But the profound silence was broken by a sound that did not belong, a weak, frantic scrabbling from behind a cluster of prickly pear cactus. Curiosity pulled me from the trail. And that is when I saw him. A German Shepherd puppy, no more than 8 or 9 weeks old, all oversized paws and ears that he hadn't grown into yet. His black and tan coat was matted with dust and something dark and sticky. He was exhausted, his small body trembling with the last vestiges of a battle he had somehow won. Lying near him, its spine clearly broken and its head a mangled ruin, was a Texas rattlesnake. The puppy let out a soft whimper, a sound of both triumph and confusion, and nudged the dead serpent with his nose. For a fleeting moment, I smiled at his courage. But the smile vanished as my eyes took in the full scene. My blood ran cold. He had won the fight, but the war was already raging inside his veins. His back left leg was the source of the dark, sticky mess. It was swollen to twice the size of his other leg, a grotesque, puffy limb that looked horribly out of place on his small frame. Near his hip, 2 tiny puncture marks were weeping a thin, pinkish fluid. The venom's work was swift and brutal. The puppy tried to take a step, wobbled, and collapsed in a heap, his breathing coming in shallow, ragged pants. He looked at his own leg as if it were a foreign object, a betrayal by his own body. That look, that mixture of a warrior's pride and a baby's dawning horror, struck a chord deep inside me. It was the same look I had seen in the eyes of young men facing a reality too terrible to comprehend. I dropped my pack and moved toward him, my heart pounding a heavy, urgent rhythm against my ribs. As I closed the distance, a voice, raw and slurred, ripped through the air. "Get the hell away from my dog!" I froze. A man stepped out from the shadow of a rusted, dilapidated trailer I hadn't noticed, half hidden by mesquite brush. He was thin and wiry, with a stained shirt and a face that hadn't seen a razor in weeks. He held a bottle of whiskey, half empty, in a grimy hand. "He's been bit," I said, keeping my voice low and steady, the way you do when approaching a wild, unpredictable animal. "By that rattler. Look at his leg. He needs a vet now." The man squinted, then spat a stream of brown tobacco juice into the dust. "So what? That's his job. Vermin dog. He kills a snake, he dies. Circle of life." The coldness of his words was stunning. The puppy whimpered again, a high, thin sound of pure agony. A cold rage, clean and sharp, settled over me. There was no time to argue. I looked from the man's watery, defiant eyes to the dying puppy, whose gaze was starting to glaze over. "I'm taking him," I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper, the tone I used long ago when there was no room left for negotiation. The man puffed out his chest. "The hell you are. That's my property." I pulled my phone from my pocket, holding it up. Animal cruelty is a felony in Texas, especially this kind. I send a picture of that leg, along with your words, to the sheriff, and your life changes forever. Fines, maybe jail time. Is that worth more than this dog you call worthless? His drunken bravado flickered. He stared at me, at the phone, at the dying pup. Finally, he waved a dismissive hand. "Fine. Take the damn thing. It's half dead anyway." I didn't waste a second. I scooped the puppy into my arms. He was terrifyingly light and burning with fever. His swollen leg was as hard as rock. I turned and ran for my truck, the only sounds being my pounding boots, the puppy's failing breaths, and the frantic beat of my own heart in a desperate race against the poison. The week that followed was a blur of antiseptic smells and the rhythmic, electronic beeps of machines that were keeping a tiny heart beating. Dr. Evans, the veterinarian, was a woman with tired lines around her eyes but a steady, compassionate voice. She was honest with me from the start. "He's a fighter," she said on the third day, pointing to a chart. "His vitals are stabilizing. But the tissue damage from the venom was extensive. He will live, but he will carry the story of that fight with him always." She meant the limp. The rattlesnake's venom had not just poisoned him, it had dissolved tissue, leaving behind a roadmap of destruction that his small body could never fully repair. It was in that quiet, sterile room, looking at the small, bandaged creature in a glass box, that I gave him his name, Max, for Maximus. A little warrior who had faced down a monster and somehow, against all odds, had survived. Bringing him home was not the joyful moment people imagine. The quiet of my house, once a comfort, now felt heavy with a fragile, nervous energy. Max was not a grateful, tail-wagging puppy. He was a wild thing, a creature of pure survival. The moment I set him down, he scrambled on 3 legs, his fourth held awkwardly off the floor, and wedged himself into the darkest corner of the kitchen, between the refrigerator and the wall. And there he stayed. A low, guttural growl rumbled in his chest if I moved too quickly or came too close. He wouldn't look at me. His eyes, dark and intelligent, were always fixed on a point beyond me, as if seeing threats I could not. He had learned his first and hardest lesson in the Texas dust, that the world was pain, and a hand reaching out was its most likely source. I understood that kind of wound, the kind that doesn't bleed. I had my own. I knew you couldn't force healing. You couldn't rush trust. You had to earn it, moment by moment, breath by breath. So began our silent routine. I would place a bowl of food and fresh water on the floor. Then I would leave the room entirely, closing the door softly behind me. I would only hear the faint clinking of the bowl after several minutes of silence. For the first week, he was a ghost I only heard. Then I began to stay. I'd bring a book and sit on the floor on the opposite side of the room, not looking at him, just existing in his space. I spoke to him in a low, steady monotone, telling him about my day, about the weather, about anything at all, not asking for a response, just letting my voice become part of the quiet landscape of the house. Weeks bled into a month. The process was painstakingly slow. I started tossing him small pieces of boiled chicken, a currency of peace. At first, he would wait until I was gone to retrieve them. Then he began to snatch them while I was still in the room, retreating immediately to his dark corner to devour them. Each piece of chicken that disappeared was a small victory, a tiny chip in the fortress of fear he had built around his heart. I saw so much of myself in his cautious, wounded spirit. We were 2 solitary beings, learning to share a space, learning that not all presences meant danger. The breakthrough came on a quiet Tuesday evening. I was sitting on the living room floor, methodically cleaning my hiking gear. The scent of leather and oil filled the air. For the first time, Max limped out of the kitchen and into the living room with me. He lay down about 10 feet away, his head on his paws, just watching. He didn't growl, he was just watching. My heart hammered in my chest, but I forced my movements to remain slow and calm. After a long while, I held out my hand, palm open and still. He watched it for what felt like an eternity. Then he rose, limped slowly toward me, and pushed his cold, wet nose into the center of my palm. He held it there for just a second. I barely dared to breathe. He flinched when I gently stroked his head, but he did not pull away. The contact lasted only a moment before he retreated to his bed, but it was enough. A wall had not fallen, but a single stone had been loosened, and for the first time, the silence in my house felt less like emptiness and more like peace. Months passed, and the Texas summer settled in, hot and heavy. The bond between Max and me had solidified into a quiet, easy companionship. He was my shadow, following me from the house to the workshop, his permanent, rhythmic limp, a constant reminder of the day our lives intersected. But while he had given me his complete trust, a small, invisible barrier remained between him and my 10-year-old son, Caleb. Max tolerated Caleb with a patient stillness, but he kept his distance. He understood the boy was part of my world, but he had not yet made him part of his. It was on a father-son camping trip, an attempt to bridge that very distance, that everything changed. We had set up our small tent in what seemed like a perfect spot, a wide, flat arroyo, a dry riverbed sheltered by low canyon walls. The air was still and baked, and the silence felt peaceful. As the afternoon sun began to dip, casting long shadows from the ocotillo plants, a change came over the sky. To the west, miles away over the distant mountains, the brilliant blue bruised into a deep, moody purple. The wind began to stir, not a cooling breeze, but a restless, agitated whisper that carried the faint metallic scent of rain on dry earth. I watched it with a casual eye. Desert storms were a spectacle, but this one was far off. Down in our sheltered wash, the sun was still warm on our faces. I was showing Caleb how to find flat skipping stones, and Max was dozing in a patch of shade. There was no sense of danger, only the quiet joy of a father and son sharing a moment in the wild. Max felt it first. He shot to his feet, as if struck by an electric current. A low, guttural whine started deep in his chest. His ears were pinned flat against his skull, and the fur along his spine bristled. He wasn't looking at us, or at the sky, but staring intently up the arroyo, into the hazy distance. The trembling I hadn't seen in months returned to his powerful shoulders. But this was a different fear. It was not the cowering terror of a victim, but the frantic, urgent panic of a sentinel sounding an alarm. He let out a single, sharp bark, a sound so piercing and unlike his usual noises that it made both Caleb and me jump. He ran to me, pushed his nose hard against my leg, and then bolted towards the steep, rocky side of the canyon, looking back with wild, desperate eyes. "Dad, what's wrong with him?" Caleb asked, his voice trembling a little. "It's okay, son. Probably just a coyote," I said, but I didn't believe it. I had never seen Max act this way. He barked again. A command this time, and when I didn't move fast enough, he did something he had never done before. He lunged, grabbed the denim cuff of my jeans in his teeth, and pulled. It wasn't an attack. It was a desperate plea. He pulled me with a strength that belied his limp, dragging me towards the safety of higher ground. At that same moment, a new sound reached my ears, a low, deep rumble that wasn't thunder. It seemed to come from the ground beneath my feet. In that split second, instinct took over. I trusted the dog's terror. "Caleb, up! Let's go, now!" I grabbed my son's hand, and we scrambled up the rocky incline, Max leading the way, his claws finding purchase on the stone. We were no more than 15 feet up when the sound became a deafening roar. A wall of churning brown water, thick with uprooted trees and debris, exploded down the arroyo. It was a liquid monster, moving with impossible speed and power. It hit our campsite and obliterated it in an instant. Our tent, our cooler, our gear, all of it vanished as if it had never been. We huddled together on the ledge, my arm tight around my shaking son, and watched the terrifying display of nature's force. My heart hammered against my ribs. We had been in a death trap and had been too ignorant to see it. I looked down at Max. He was trembling violently, pressed hard against my leg, but the frantic barking had stopped. He looked from the raging torrent below, then up at me, and finally, he pushed his wet nose forward and gave Caleb's hand a soft, reassuring lick. The dog I had saved from the venom of a snake had just saved us from the fury of a flood. He had faced a terror far greater than his own ghosts and had not only triumphed, but had become a protector. In the quiet aftermath of the flood, as the last of the churning water subsided into a muddy stream, the three of us huddled on that rocky ledge. The invisible wall between Max and my son had not just been breached, it had been utterly washed away. Caleb had his arm wrapped tightly around Max's neck, his face buried in the dog's damp fur. And Max, instead of stiffening or pulling away as he once would have, leaned into the embrace, letting out a soft, low sigh. The terror of the flood had forged a new reality. On the long, quiet walk back to the truck through the devastated canyon, Caleb kept one hand on Max's back, and the dog stayed pressed close to his side. The tentative respect had finally blossomed into a fierce, unspoken love. From that day forward, they were inseparable. The final shadows of trauma that had clung to Max's spirit seemed to vanish in the sunshine of my son's affection. I would find them in the backyard, Caleb laughing as Max, his limp all but forgotten, in his boundless joy, chased after a battered tennis ball. Other times I'd see Caleb sitting under the shade of our big oak tree, reading a book aloud, with Max's heavy head resting peacefully in his lap, his dark eyes blinking slowly. He had become Caleb's guardian, his confidant, his unwavering friend. The dog that I had brought into our lives had, in turn, chosen my son as his own. He was no longer just a rescued animal living in our house. He was a vital, beating heart within our family. Our bond deepened too, evolving into a partnership built on a language that had no need for words. I took him with me into the deep backcountry, and his instincts, once honed for mere survival, now sharpened for teamwork. He learned my silent hand signals with an astonishing speed, often anticipating my needs before I was even aware of them myself. A subtle flick of his ear told me which way the wind was shifting. A tensing of his powerful shoulders alerted me to deer grazing over the next ridge. Out there, in the green and red cathedrals of the Texas wilderness, we moved as one entity. He was no longer just my dog, he was my partner. He had found his purpose, not just as a pet, but as a working companion, his intelligence and drive finally given a positive channel. Years have passed now. Caleb is away at college, his smiling face looking out from photographs on the mantelpiece. The house is quiet again, filled with the particular silence that follows a child growing up and moving on. But it is not empty, not anymore. As I sit here tonight before the crackling fire, Max is lying at my feet, his great head resting on my boot. The firelight catches the silver that now frosts his dark muzzle, and the limp in his back leg is a little more pronounced in the cold weather, a gentle reminder of his first and hardest battle. He will raise his head and look at me with those dark, wise eyes, and I know he sees me. He sees the whole story of us. I see it in his eyes too, the terrified puppy facing a monster, the haunted survivor hiding in the shadows, the selfless hero on a crumbling cliffside. I went into those woods all those years ago seeking solitude, a way to quiet the noise in my own head. I came out with a dog who would save my son, and in doing so, save me from the quiet emptiness I had mistaken for peace. We saved each other, Max and I. He taught me that the deepest wounds are not always the ones you can see, and that a single act of compassion can ripple outwards, creating a hero, building a family, and proving that even after all the venom and the pain, a good heart can learn to beat again, strong and true. Max's story began with cruelty and neglect, a life nearly dismissed as worthless in the Texas dust. But a single act of compassion revealed the hero within, a truth that lives in so many animals waiting for our help. If you believe that every one of them deserves that same chance to be healed, to be loved, and to find the profound purpose they carry in their hearts, then you are one of us. Please help our voice be heard by subscribing to the channel. Share this story to spread that message of hope, and let us know in the comments what loyalty means to you. Your journey with us doesn't have to end here. Click the video now on your screen to watch another story of rescue and redemption.